Welcome to the Discourse Analyzer AI Toolkit, where articles come alive. You're listening to the audio version of our article. For the full text and an interactive experience, check out the link in the description below. Interact with any selection using our AI assistant to enhance your understanding. Let's explore.
Gendered violence in discourse analysis. Interactive assistant gendered violence refers to acts of violence that are directed against individuals based on their gender, often rooted in societal norms and power imbalances. It encompasses a wide range of forms, including domestic violence, sexual assault, harassment, and femicide, and is overwhelmingly experienced by women and girls, though it also affects men and gender non-conforming individuals. In discourse analysis, gendered violence is studied to examine how language constructs, reflects, and reinforces societal attitudes about gender, power, and violence. It also explores how these discourses can perpetuate victim blaming, marginalize survivors, and normalize or justify violent behavior. Discourse analysis of gendered violence focuses on how language is used in media, legal systems, public debates, and personal narratives to frame incidents of violence, portray victims and perpetrators, and shape public understanding of gendered power dynamics. By analyzing the linguistic features of news reports, court transcripts, policy documents, and social media, discourse analysis reveals the societal ideologies and cultural norms that sustain or challenge gender-based violence. Key features of gendered violence in discourse analysis. 1. Framing of victims and perpetrators. A key aspect of discourse on gendered violence is how victims and perpetrators are framed. Discourse analysis examines how language constructs identities of victims as vulnerable or complicit, and perpetrators as either evil, misunderstood, or exonerated based on their gender. Example. In news reporting, a headline might read, "Woman killed in domestic dispute," minimizing the agency of the perpetrator and framing the violence as a dispute, rather than a violent act. Discourse analysis would explore how the language downplays the severity of the crime and obscures the power dynamics of gendered violence. 2. Victim blaming discourses. Victim blaming is a common discursive practice in cases of gendered violence, where the victim's behavior, appearance, or choices are scrutinized to explain or justify the violence. Discourse analysis investigates how language shifts responsibility from the perpetrator to the victim, reinforcing harmful gender stereotypes. Example. A court report might state, "The victim was wearing revealing clothing and had been drinking at the time of the assault," implying that her behavior contributed to the violence. Discourse analysis would focus on how this language reinforces a narrative that holds women responsible for violence committed against them, while absolving the perpetrator of full responsibility. 3. Silencing and marginalization of survivors. In discussions of gendered violence, survivors are often silenced or marginalized, either by being disbelieved, dismissed, or ignored. Discourse analysis examines how language contributes to the erasure of survivors' voices, particularly in legal contexts, media coverage, and institutional responses. Example. In a media report on sexual harassment, a sentence like, "The allegations are being investigated, but there is no evidence at this time," may serve to discredit the survivor's testimony. Discourse analysis would explore how the use of the word allegations and the emphasis on the lack of evidence subtly undermines the survivor's credibility. 4. Gendered power dynamics in legal discourse. Legal systems play a crucial role in shaping societal attitudes toward gendered violence through the language used in courtrooms, police reports, and legal judgments. Discourse analysis examines how legal language reflects and reinforces gendered power dynamics, often protecting perpetrators or minimizing the experiences of victims. Example. In court, a defense lawyer might argue, "The accused had no prior history of violence and was provoked by the victim's behavior," framing the violence as a result of the victim's actions. Discourse analysis would investigate how legal arguments like these shift the focus from the perpetrator's responsibility to the victim's supposed provocations, reflecting broader societal biases around gender and violence. 5. Normalization of gendered violence. Normalization occurs when acts of gendered violence are downplayed, trivialized, or treated as inevitable aspects of life, particularly in certain cultural or social contexts. Discourse analysis explores how language contributes to the normalization of violence, making it seem less serious or more acceptable. Example: in everyday conversation, someone might say, "Boys will be boys," to excuse aggressive or inappropriate behavior by young men. Discourse analysis would explore how this language normalizes harmful behavior by linking it to naturalized gender traits, thus minimizing the severity of the violence or misconduct. 6. Media representations and sensationalism. Media representations of gendered violence often sensationalize the crime, focusing on shocking details or using salacious language that distracts from the underlying power dynamics and systemic issues. Discourse analysis looks at how these representations shape public perceptions of both the violence itself and the societal responses to it. Example: a news article might headline a story about domestic violence with, "Love triangle ends in tragedy," sensationalizing the event by framing it as a romantic drama rather than focusing on the systemic issue of intimate partner violence. Discourse analysis would examine how such headlines trivialize the violence and shift focus away from the perpetrator's accountability. 7. Language of advocacy and resistance. On the other side, discourse around gendered violence can also serve as a tool for advocacy and resistance. Activist groups and survivors often use language to reclaim power, raise awareness, and challenge societal norms around gendered violence. Discourse analysis examines how these counter-narratives disrupt dominant discourses and promote social change. Example: in activist campaigns, phrases like, "believe survivors," and "no means no," are used to challenge victim blaming and assert the right to bodily autonomy. Discourse analysis would explore how these slogans create a language of empowerment and shift the focus from victim behavior to perpetrator accountability. Methods for analyzing gendered violence in discourse. 1. Critical discourse analysis, CDA. Critical discourse analysis, CDA, examines how power, ideology, and social inequality are reflected and reproduced through language in discussions of gendered violence. CDA focuses on how societal structures and gendered hierarchies are maintained through discursive practices. Example: a CDA of courtroom language in domestic violence cases might reveal how judges and lawyers unconsciously reproduce gendered power dynamics by focusing on the victim's behavior or appearance rather than the perpetrator's actions. The analysis would examine how these linguistic choices reflect and reinforce patriarchal norms. 2. Frame analysis. Frame analysis investigates how incidents of gendered violence are framed in public discourse, focusing on how certain aspects are highlighted while others are downplayed or ignored. This method helps to understand how violence is interpreted and how blame, responsibility, and power are allocated. Example: media coverage of sexual assault might frame it as a he said, she said situation, casting doubt on the credibility of the survivor. Frame analysis would explore how this framing affects public perception of the assault, potentially discouraging other survivors from coming forward. 3. Narrative analysis. Narrative analysis examines the stories told about gendered violence in legal, media, and personal contexts. This method looks at how narratives construct identities, assign blame, and shape societal attitudes toward violence, victims, and perpetrators. Example: a documentary about domestic violence might focus on the survivor's journey of empowerment, using language like, "she broke free from the cycle of abuse and rebuilt her life." Narrative analysis would examine how this story frames the survivor as empowered and how it counters dominant narratives that focus on victimization rather than agency. 4. Conversation analysis. Conversation analysis focuses on how gendered violence is discussed in everyday interactions, including how victims are questioned, how survivors share their stories, and how bystanders or authorities respond. This method helps to uncover subtle patterns of questioning, silencing, or disbelief that may arise in conversations about violence. Example: in a police interrogation, an officer might ask, "Why didn't you leave earlier if you felt unsafe?" suggesting that the victim's failure to act contributed to their victimization. Conversation analysis would explore how these questions subtly shift blame onto the victim and reflect broader societal tendencies toward victim blaming. Examples of gendered violence in discourse analysis. Example 1. Victim blaming in news media. A news report about a rape case might describe the victim as having been drinking and alone at the time of the attack, implying that her behavior contributed to the violence. Discourse analysis would explore how this language shifts blame to the victim and reinforces harmful stereotypes about women's responsibility for preventing sexual violence. Example 2. Legal defense in domestic violence cases. In a domestic violence case, a defense attorney might argue, the accused was under a great deal of stress, and the situation escalated, framing the violence as a momentary lapse rather than an intentional act. Discourse analysis would investigate how this narrative minimizes the perpetrator's responsibility and normalizes abusive behavior by portraying it as a result of external circumstances. Example 3. Gendered violence in social media activism. In the #MeToo movement, survivors of sexual violence use language like, "I was silenced for years, but now I'm speaking out," reclaiming their voice and challenging the culture of silence around gendered violence. Discourse analysis would explore how the movement's language empowers survivors and shifts public discourse toward believing and supporting victims. Example 4. Sensationalized headlines in domestic violence reporting. A newspaper might headline a story about a murder-suicide with, "Jealous husband snaps, kills wife in passion-fueled rage," sensationalizing the violence and framing it as an emotional reaction rather than a premeditated act of gendered violence. Discourse analysis would examine how this language downplays the systemic nature of intimate partner violence by focusing on emotions rather than control and power. Example 5. Legal testimonies in sexual assault cases. During a sexual assault trial, a defense lawyer might ask the victim questions like, "What were you wearing that night?" implying that the victim's clothing choices contributed to the assault. Discourse analysis would explore how these questions reinforce the idea that women's behavior and appearance can provoke or justify violence, shifting responsibility away from the perpetrator. Challenges in analyzing gendered violence through discourse. 1. Victim silencing. One of the major challenges in analyzing gendered violence is the silencing of victims, whose stories may be marginalized or disbelieved. Discourse analysts must navigate how this silence is maintained through language and how it can be countered through advocacy and support. 2. Cultural norms and sensitivities. Cultural norms around gender and violence differ widely, and discourse analysts must be sensitive to how these norms shape the language used to discuss gendered violence. Certain discourses may be more subtle or implicit in different cultural contexts, requiring careful analysis. 3. Normalization in subtle discourses. Gendered violence is often normalized through everyday language, making it difficult to identify and challenge. Discourse analysts must pay attention to subtle discursive practices that contribute to the minimization or justification of violence, even when they seem innocuous. Conclusion. Gendered violence is a pervasive social issue that is deeply embedded in public and private discourse. Through discourse analysis, researchers can uncover how language constructs, reinforces, or challenges societal attitudes toward gender, power, and violence. By analyzing media representations, legal language, personal testimonies, and advocacy campaigns, discourse analysis reveals the power dynamics, victim-blaming practices, and normalization of violence that sustain gendered violence. It also highlights how counter-narratives, such as those seen in social movements like #MeToo, use language to reclaim power, support survivors, and advocate for systemic change. Understanding the role of discourse in shaping perceptions of gendered violence is essential for addressing its root causes and creating more just and equitable societies. Frequently asked questions. What is gendered violence in the context of discourse analysis? Gendered violence refers to acts of violence directed at individuals based on their gender, rooted in societal norms and power imbalances. Discourse analysis examines how language constructs, reflects, and influences societal attitudes toward gender, power, and violence, highlighting how these discourses can perpetuate victim blaming, normalize violence, or advocate for change. How does discourse analysis approach the framing of victims and perpetrators? Discourse analysis looks at how victims and perpetrators are portrayed in language, such as in news or legal discourse. It explores if victims are framed as vulnerable or complicit and whether perpetrators are described in ways that evoke sympathy, justification, or condemnation. This framing affects public perception and contributes to how responsibility is assigned. What is victim blaming, and how is it reflected in language? Victim blaming occurs when language shifts responsibility for violence from the perpetrator to the victim. For example, phrases like, "the victim was wearing revealing clothing," imply that the victim's actions contributed to the violence. Discourse analysis investigates how such language reinforces harmful gender norms and perpetuates violence. How do power dynamics play a role in legal discourse around gendered violence? In legal settings, language often reflects power dynamics that may protect perpetrators or minimize victims' experiences. For instance, arguments that frame violence as a reaction to provocation shift the focus from perpetrator accountability to victim behavior. Discourse analysis uncovers how these discursive practices reinforce gendered power hierarchies. What role does normalization play in gendered violence discourse? Normalization involves downplaying the severity of violence, making it seem inevitable or acceptable. Phrases like, "boys will be boys," excuse aggressive behavior by attributing it to natural gender traits. Discourse analysis examines how such language trivializes violence and prevents accountability. How are media representations of gendered violence analyzed? Media often sensationalizes or trivializes gendered violence, using language that distracts from systemic issues. Discourse analysis explores how headlines and stories frame violence, e.g., "love triangle ends in tragedy," focusing on whether language holds perpetrators accountable or sensationalizes the event. Can discourse also empower and challenge gendered violence? Yes, language can be used for advocacy and empowerment. Activist movements often use slogans like, "Believe survivors," to counter victim blaming and promote bodily autonomy. Discourse analysis studies how such counter-narratives challenge dominant discourses and create social change. What methods are used to analyze gendered violence in discourse? Critical discourse analysis, CDA, reveals how power and social inequalities are maintained through language in legal, media, and everyday interactions. Frame analysis examines how incidents are presented to highlight or downplay certain aspects. Narrative analysis looks at stories told about violence to understand how identities and blame are constructed. Conversation analysis studies real-time language use, such as victim questioning, to reveal patterns of silencing or blame. What are examples of gendered violence discourse in practice? Victim blaming. News reports emphasizing a victim's actions, e.g., being alone or drinking, shift responsibility away from the perpetrator. Defense arguments. Legal language framing violence as a reaction to provocation minimizes accountability. #MeToo movement. Survivors reclaim their voice with phrases like, "I was silenced, but now I speak out," which counteract silencing and promote solidarity. What are some challenges in analyzing discourse on gendered violence? Victim silencing. Ensuring that the voices of survivors are heard and analyzed without being overshadowed by dominant narratives. Cultural sensitivities. Recognizing how cultural norms shape language about gendered violence. Subtle normalization. Identifying everyday language that normalizes or trivializes violence, which may be implicit or indirect.